My name is Natalie Mercer. I'm 31 years old, and 3 weeks ago my mother pointed at the front door and told me to get out and never come back. She was screaming so hard her voice cracked, like I had done something unforgivable, like I was some burden she had finally decided to throw away. So I left. I didn't beg, I didn't argue, and I didn't remind her that I had spent years quietly holding together a life she was standing inside. I just picked up my bag, walked out of that house, and let the door close behind me. What she didn't know was that some doors don't just shut emotionally, they shut financially too. The strange part is that I had not gone there looking for a fight. I went there the way I always did, trying to keep the peace, trying to act like the little digs, the cold tone, and the endless judgment didn't get under my skin. But that afternoon, something was said, something was exposed, and suddenly I was no longer family. I was an outsider, an embarrassment, a problem that needed to be removed. For the first few days after I left, I kept expecting my phone to ring with an apology, or at least with enough decency to ask if I was okay. That call never came. What did come, weeks later, was my father standing in front of me with a face I had never seen before, asking one question in a voice that sounded more scared than angry. He wanted to know why the mortgage had stopped getting paid. I looked at him and gave him the only answer that made sense after everything that had happened. I'm not your child. Not in the way that seemed to matter to them. And once I tell you what led up to that moment, you'll understand why those 6 words hit harder than any scream my mother threw at me that day. Before I tell you what she said after the truth came out, and what happened when I actually walked away, tell me what time it is where you are right now and where you're watching from, because I honestly want to see just how far this story travels. I grew up in Matthews, just outside Charlotte, in the kind of neighborhood where every house looked stable from the street even when the people inside were barely holding it together. We were never the family that looked dramatic. We looked normal. Trim lawn, decent porch, church on holidays, polite smiles in the driveway. But money had always been a quiet emergency in our house, the kind nobody named out loud unless things got bad enough to turn into blame. My father had spent years working in warehouse operations, always promising the next position would be better, always believing one more steady stretch would fix everything. My mother worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic and treated appearances like a second full-time job. We could be behind on bills, but she still wanted the house spotless, the curtains pressed, the neighbors convinced we were doing just fine. I learned early that in our family, truth mattered less than presentation. I was the one who studied hard, stayed out of trouble, got scholarships, took extra shifts, and built a life that made people say I was going places. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had a solid job in healthcare compliance, a nice apartment in Charlotte, and enough financial stability to breathe without checking my bank account 3 times a day. Then, my father got downsized, and whatever fragile balance my parents had been pretending to maintain collapsed fast. They fell behind on the mortgage, then behind again, and by the time my mother finally called me crying, the bank was already sending letters with language serious enough to make my stomach drop. She kept saying they were going to lose the house, that everything they had worked for was about to disappear, that she didn't know what to do. I still remember standing in my kitchen with my phone pressed to my ear, staring out the window while she cried, and feeling that old reflex take over, the one that had followed me my whole life. Fix it. Don't ask who created the mess. Don't ask why no one planned ahead. Just fix it. So I did. I covered the overdue amount first, then I called the mortgage servicer, asked questions my parents had never bothered to ask, and figured out how bad things really were. Worse than they admitted. Worse than they probably understood. There was no magical solution coming. No relative stepping in. No retirement fund. No backup plan. There was just me. I set up recurring payments from my own account and told myself it would only be temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until things calmed down, just until I could breathe again without wondering if the house I grew up in would be auctioned off because nobody in it knew how to face reality. Temporary turned into 4 years. 4 years of monthly withdrawals so consistent they became part of my life the way rent or groceries were, Except these payments weren't keeping a roof over my head. They were keeping one over people who never quite stopped acting like I was the difficult one. My mother never knew the full mechanics of what I had arranged, and honestly, she didn't want to. She preferred the version where the bank had worked something out, and life could go back to being performatively respectable. My father asked fewer questions than anyone, which was its own kind of answer. He was the kind of man who mistook silence for decency and avoidance for peace. If a problem could be delayed, he delayed it. If tension entered a room, he stepped around it like furniture. Meanwhile, I became the invisible support beam holding the whole place up. I drove out most Sundays for lunch or cookouts, brought groceries more often than not, replaced things around the house when they broke, and listened to my mother complain about people who, in her opinion, were selfish, shallow, irresponsible, entitled, or ungrateful. Depending on the day, I was somehow all for. She loved reminding me that I lived in the city now, that I had a clean little office job, that I didn't understand what real pressure looked like. She rolled her eyes when I talked about work, made comments about how I was always too busy, then acted offended if I missed a weekend. If I bought something nice for myself, she'd say it must be easy to waste money when you had nobody else to think about. If I dated someone, she found a flaw. If I stayed single, that became a flaw too. Nothing about me was ever simply enough. My father would sit there through all of it, sometimes staring at the TV, sometimes stirring his coffee, sometimes giving me that tired look men like him give when they want credit for not being the one doing the damage. My younger brother had already figured out what I took years to admit. He moved to Denver, kept his distance, and limited family contact to the bare minimum. I used to think that meant he was detached. Later, I realized it meant he was healthy enough to leave. I was the one who stayed because I thought loyalty looked like endurance. I postponed buying my own place because I was paying theirs. I turned down trips because there was always some expense at the house. I told myself I didn't resent it, then wondered why I was exhausted all the time. The truth was ugly and simple. I was financing the stability of a family that still treated me like I was failing some impossible emotional test. And because nobody knew the full truth, nobody had to feel grateful. They got to keep their house and their pride. I got to keep writing checks and pretending that love and obligation were the same thing. Everything blew up on a Sunday that started so normally it should have warned me. I drove out to Matthew's around noon, picked up drinks on the way, and walked into the backyard to find my mother already performing happiness. She was in one of those moods where every sentence sounded cheerful if you didn't listen too closely. She'd arranged the patio furniture, marinated too much food, and kept mentioning that she had big plans in the works. I should have known that meant she was trying to prove something. While we were eating, she finally brought it up. She said she had been talking to someone about refinancing, maybe pulling cash out of the house, maybe doing something smart for once instead of just sitting on equity. Then she laughed and said, maybe she deserved a new SUV after all these years. Maybe she and my father could finally take a cruise like other people their age. She said it loud enough for me to hear the message underneath it. We're fine. We're more than fine. We're the kind of people who still have options. I remember looking at her and wondering how deep denial could really go. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, smiled like she was about to close some glamorous deal, and answered on speaker without leaving the table. At first it sounded routine. Identity verification, property address, a few polite questions. Then the loan officer said there was an issue with the file. He said the payment history reflected a consistent outside funding source over the last 48 months and that they needed clarification because the account making the mortgage payments did not belong to either borrower listed on the loan. I don't think I'll ever forget the silence that hit that yard after those words. My mother's face changed so fast it was almost hard to process. 1 second she looked confident. The next she looked exposed, then furious. She took the phone off speaker, but it was too late. Everyone at that table had heard enough. She ended the call, turned slowly toward me, and I could feel what was coming before she said a word. She asked me what that woman was talking about, and when I didn't answer fast enough, she stood up and asked louder. I tried to keep my voice calm. I told her I had been making sure the mortgage got paid. I told her I did it because the house was weeks from disaster the first time, and because after that, nobody in that house ever came close to getting financially stable enough to keep it afloat. I thought maybe the truth would land with shock first, maybe gratitude later, maybe humiliation in the middle. What I did not expect was the immediate rage. She accused me of humiliating her, of sneaking behind their backs, of trying to act like I owned the house, like I owned them. She said I wanted people to think she was incompetent, that I'd done it to feel superior, that this was exactly what happened when children made too much money and forgot where they came from. I told her nobody had forgotten where they came from more than the people sitting in a house they hadn't actually been paying for. That was the moment the whole thing snapped. She started shouting so loudly the neighbors could probably hear every word through their fences. Ungrateful, manipulative, arrogant. She said I had no right to interfere in their lives, no right to make decisions for them, no right to turn their home into some charity project. I looked at my father because part of me still believed he might do something if it got bad enough. He didn't. He sat there looking stunned, but not stunned enough to speak. Not stunned enough to defend me. Not stunned enough to say that maybe the woman paying the mortgage for 4 years didn't deserve to be screamed at in her own childhood backyard. Then my mother pointed toward the gate and said the words that changed everything. Get out and never come back. The kind of silence that follows a sentence like that is different from ordinary silence. It isn't empty. It's final. I remember standing there for a second, waiting to see if she'd pull it back, waiting to see if my father would step in, waiting for one decent instinct from someone. Neither came, so I went inside, grabbed the overnight bag I sometimes left in my old room, and walked back out without another argument because suddenly I understood something I should have understood years earlier. If I had to defend my right to basic dignity in a house I was helping keep standing, then nothing about what I was doing there was love anymore. By the time I got back to my apartment in Charlotte, I was still shaking. I opened my laptop, pulled up the recurring payment and stared at the screen for maybe 10 seconds before I canceled it. No speech, no dramatic soundtrack, just one click. Then I left the family group chat, put my phone on silent, and let them live inside the consequences of my absence for the first time in years. The first week after that felt strangely quiet, like the world had gone muffled. I went to work, answered emails, sat in meetings, and acted like my whole family hadn't detonated over barbecue and buried finances. At night, I replayed the argument in my head and kept circling the same questions. Had she really meant it? Had my father really let me walk out like that? Had I actually just stopped paying the mortgage on the house I had protected for years? The answer to all three was yes, but my nervous system lagged behind reality. I still caught myself reaching for my phone on Sundays out of habit, still thought about whether they needed groceries, still had those tiny trained impulses that make people like me so easy to use. My best friend Erica was the first person who didn't let me romanticize any of it. She came over with takeout, listened to everything, and then said the sentence that made me sit back in my chair and go quiet. She said, "Natalie, the only time they treated you like family was when you were useful." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say it was more complicated than that. But the thing about a clean sentence is that it cuts through all the loyalty-based fog. I started therapy that same week because I knew if I didn't, I'd eventually talk myself into returning to the same arrangement just to relieve the guilt. Meanwhile, the messages started. At first, they came from my father and acted like nothing had happened. "How's work? Are you okay? Give us a call when you can." Then the tone shifted. "Have you spoken to the bank lately? There seems to be an issue with the mortgage portal." A notice came in the mail. Then, once they connected the obvious dots, my mother started sending messages through other people because she had blocked me herself in a fit of pride, and apparently hadn't thought that part through. My aunt texted that my mother was very upset about some banking confusion. A cousin asked if I knew why my parents had gotten a default notice. Erica looked at one message and laughed in disbelief. She said your mother really said get out and never come back, then acted shocked when your money left too. Weeks passed, and I held the line. The house was now doing what houses do when nobody pays for them. Late fees stacked, calls escalated, threat letters got sharper. My father finally stopped pretending this was a technical issue and started trying to reach me with actual urgency. I still didn't answer. Not because I was cruel, but because I knew exactly how these cycles worked. If I let them skip the part where they acknowledged what happened, they would go straight back to the part where I fixed everything, and they learned nothing. My therapist helped me put language to something I had never let myself say out loud. I was not abandoning my family. I was stepping out of a role they had assigned me without consent, and then punished me for fulfilling too well. That difference mattered. Around week 3, my brother called and said he had heard from our father. He said the bank was moving faster than they expected and our mother was in full panic mode. He also said something else that stayed with me. He said Dad only notices a fire when the smoke reaches him. A few days later, my building's front desk called up to say a man was downstairs asking for me. It was my father. He had never come to my apartment before. Not once. Not when I moved in. Not on birthdays. Not out of curiosity. Not out of pride. But suddenly, because the mortgage money had stopped, he had found my address and made the drive. I met him in the lobby because I wasn't ready to invite that conversation into my home. He looked older than he had a month earlier, shoulders bent forward, eyes tired, the kind of tired that comes from fear more than age. For a few seconds neither of us said anything. Then he asked if we could sit, and we moved to a pair of chairs near the windows. He didn't waste time with small talk. Maybe he finally knew he had run out of room for it. He looked at me and asked, "Why did you stop paying the mortgage?" There it was, the question that had traveled all the way from their house to my building, the question that mattered more than why I left, more than how I was doing, more than whether I had eaten or slept, or spent 3 straight Sundays trying not to cry in my own kitchen. I looked back at him and said, "I'm not your child." He blinked, like he thought he had misheard me, so I said it again, slower. "I'm not your child, not in the way that seems to matter to either of you." He asked what that was supposed to mean, and for the first time in my life, I didn't soften anything to make it easier for him to hear. I told him it meant that the moment my mother screamed at me to get out and never come back, and he sat there and let her do it, I stopped being their daughter in every practical way they seemed to value. I told him that when bills were due, I was family. When the house needed saving, I was family. When groceries showed up, when repairs got handled, when money quietly flowed in so they could keep pretending they were stable, then I was absolutely family. But when the truth came out, when my mother felt embarrassed, when she needed someone to blame for her own shame, suddenly I was an outsider, an intruder, an ungrateful problem to be thrown out. I said I wasn't going to keep paying for the privilege of being disrespected. He tried at first to explain my mother away, the way he always had. He said she was upset, that she felt humiliated, that she didn't really mean it. I asked him which part she didn't mean. The part where she pointed at the gate. The part where she said never come back. The part where she blocked me and told relatives her own version of what happened. He had no answer for that, so I kept going. I told him what I had wanted him to see for years. That silence is not neutrality when one person keeps getting hurt. That sitting there and saying nothing every time my mother took a shot at me had not made him peaceful. It had made him safe at my expense. I told him he had accepted my support for years without asking what it cost me because it was easier than confronting the truth about his own dependence. He looked down at his hands, and for the first time I saw something in him I had never really seen before. Shame that wasn't defensive. Shame that had finally reached the point of recognition. He admitted they couldn't afford the house without me. He admitted he had suspected more than he ever asked. He admitted he had let my mother's pride govern the emotional climate of the family, because challenging her felt harder than watching me absorb the damage. Then he said he was sorry. And because I had waited so long to hear anything remotely honest from him, it actually landed. Not enough to undo anything. Not enough to make me take the payments back. But enough to crack something open. He asked what it would take to talk as a family without it turning into another disaster. I told him I would agree to one conversation under strict conditions. No yelling, no revisionist history, no expectation that I would resume paying the mortgage just because they were finally scared. If my mother wanted any relationship with me moving forward, she was going to have to face what she did, not just what it cost her. He nodded and said he understood. I believed that he believed it, which was new. Before he left, he stood there awkwardly for a second like he wanted to hug me and wasn't sure he'd earned the right. He hadn't. Not really. But I let him anyway because sometimes people don't get access to forgiveness and comfort at the same speed. As he walked out of my building, I stayed in the lobby and stared through the glass for a long time. I wasn't proud of the pain. I wasn't enjoying their fear. But for the first time, the weight of that house was no longer on my chest, and I could finally tell the difference between guilt and grief. The family meeting happened the following Sunday, exactly 4 weeks after my mother had thrown me out. I drove to the house and sat in my car for a full minute before going in, because some places remember your old version of yourself too well. I rang the doorbell instead of using the key I still had, and that small choice mattered more than I expected. My father opened the door almost immediately. My mother was already in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch with the posture of someone preparing to defend herself before anyone had spoken. I stayed standing until my father asked me to sit, and even then I chose the chair across from them instead of the usual spot that made it feel like I belonged there. At first, my mother tried the same strategy she had probably been using on herself for weeks. She talked about the bank, the notices, the timeline, the stress. She spoke like the crisis had arrived out of nowhere, like some outside force had attacked the family. Finally, I asked her one question. Is there anything you want to say to me before you talk about what you need from me? That was the moment the room shifted. She looked at me, then away, then back again. She said she may have overreacted. I told her that telling your daughter to get out and never come back was not an overreaction. It was a decision. My father surprised me then by backing me up. He said, "No, Sharon, you threw her out. You don't get to shrink that now just because the consequences showed up." My mother looked stunned, but he kept going. He said we took her help and turned it into something shameful because facing our own reality felt harder than saying thank you. I reached into my bag and pulled out the payment records. 4 years of monthly mortgage payments, neatly printed, every transfer documented. I set them on the table and slid them forward. My father started flipping through the pages and went pale halfway through. My mother stared at the total like it had personally insulted her. Maybe it had. There it was in black and white. The proof that the daughter she called selfish had been carrying their household from a distance while being criticized for not performing love the right way. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. She said thank you first, and then she said she was sorry. Not graceful, not perfect, not free of pride, but real enough that I could tell fear had finally dragged honesty into the room. She admitted that finding out I had been paying the mortgage made her feel small. It made her feel exposed. It made her feel like every harsh thing she had ever said about my life had been revealed for what it really was. Jealousy, deflection, resentment toward the child who escaped and succeeded. Hearing her say it didn't heal me, but it clarified everything. Some people don't hate your strength because it hurts them. They hate it because it reveals what they refuse to build in themselves. Then we got to the part that mattered. I told them I was not resuming the mortgage payments. Not for a month. Not while they got organized. Not while emotions were high. I was done being the silent safety net that let everyone avoid adulthood. What I was willing to do was help them make a real plan. Budget. Sell if needed. Downsize. Stabilize. But I would not finance a fantasy anymore. My father agreed immediately. My mother cried, not the theatrical crying I had grown up around, but the quieter kind that comes when pride breaks instead of performing. The bank's timeline left them little room, and once we laid out the actual numbers, even my mother could see the truth. They could not keep that house, not without me, and I was no longer available for that role. The next month was brutal. They listed the house fast, accepted less than they once would have, and watched a future they had pretended was secure shrink into a much smaller reality. The new place ended up being a 2-bedroom condo outside their old neighborhood, manageable, practical, and nothing like the house my mother had spent years using as proof that she was doing just fine. She had to take evening shifts at the clinic twice a week and a weekend scheduling position from home just to help cover the new budget and rebuild what little cushion they had. The SUV disappeared from conversation. So did the cruise. Even worse for her than the financial fall was the social one. A few relatives learned enough of the truth to piece it together. The daughter she had implied was cold and self-centered had actually been the one keeping the roof over their heads. My mother never said the word humiliated, but I didn't need her to. I could see it in the way she stopped telling polished versions of the family story once reality had names and numbers attached to it. My father changed in smaller but more meaningful ways. He started handling bills directly, started speaking up, started calling me not to ask for money, but to tell me what steps they had taken on their own. My relationship with them did not become magically warm. That would have been dishonest. But it became clearer, and clear is better than fake. 6 months later, I got promoted. I started sleeping better. I stopped checking my phone with dread every Sunday. I even let myself build a personal life that didn't revolve around rescuing people who only loved me most when I was useful. My mother and I still have distance between us, but now it's honest distance, not the old kind where I pretended not to feel what she kept doing. And if there's one thing I learned from all of it, it's this. Family is not a free pass to use someone until they disappear inside your needs. Love without boundaries is not noble when it destroys the person giving it. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for yourself, and even for the people who raised you, is stop protecting them from the consequences of who they've become. That is where accountability starts. That is where self-respect comes back. And that is where real change, if it ever comes at all, has a chance to begin. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, then you already know how expensive that lesson can be. But you also know this. Walking away does not always mean you gave up on your family. Sometimes it means you finally stopped giving up on yourself.